Hello, I am, again, my name is Jordy Izzard, and I'm an Alumni Relations Officer at SAIS, and I'm here today with Betty Beachaump, who was the Registrar here for 44 years, from the years 1961 through 2005. And today is October 22nd, 2010, and it is my pleasure to be able to speak with you today. Thank you so much.
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I'm just going to ask you some questions, go down memory lane a little bit, and have this be more of a conversation than anything else. So thanks again for being here. And I guess let's just start with kind of what originally brought you to SAIS. I'd love to hear that story.
Well, I started as a student at Memphis State University in Memphis, Tennessee, and I transferred to the University of Maryland. So after graduation, a group of us thought it would be fun to rent an apartment together and work up in this area. I have to say offside, I will never again share an apartment with 4 or 5 other women and one bathroom. At any rate, we did that, and I started looking for a job, and I was interviewed by SAIS and by a stock brokerage firm. And I had to take a typing test. This story has been told, but I'll tell it again. By the employment agency wanted me to take a typing test. And SAIS had a certain rate of speed, and these were the old clunkers. You had to, really punch the keys. So I didn't pass the test. So the lady said, well, go home and work practice over the weekend and come back on Monday and we'll try it again. So I did, and I was just under the speed. So at any rate, both places offered me a job, the brokerage firm and SAIS. Well, Johns Hopkins, I guess, was the sort of the drawing card, because I didn't know anything about SAIS. And I thought, well, that sounds like a nice place. I will go there. So that's how I wound up at SAIS, even though the other firm, my starting salary was $4,000 a year. And the other firm said, well, we'll up it to $4,100. So SAIS said, well, we'll up it to $4,200. So I took it. And this was when we were over on Florida Avenue in the old building. And it's nicely described in one of these old SAIS reviews. It was an old, I think, girls' dormitory. And I was interviewed for my job by Priscilla Mason. And she told me that they're looking for someone who's very organized and could pass the typing test, obviously. Anyway, the employment agency fudged it a little bit and said I had passed the typing test. So they hired me, and my first day on the job, I came in a hat and a suit and heels and gloves, which is what you did back then, which is what I also wore to all my interviews. And so the first person that I saw on my first day was Tom Hugo, who was the bursar at that time, they called it, business manager. And he said, can I help you? And I said, I'm here to start my job. Well, they didn't have an office for me right then. I was to work for the registrar and for the newly hired admissions director, who was Aldous Chapin. Part-time for each one, or full-time, but working for both of those people. Because up till that time, everything was done in the registrar's office. Admissions, financial aid, career services, registrar's office, and there was one other, I forget what, that have now all been divided into their own separate offices. But at that time, the registrar's office did all of it. But they had decided when Francis Wilcox was hired as dean, he wanted to sort of modernize and get admissions sort of out of the registrar's office and into its own separate office. So, excuse me, Aldi Chapin and I came on the same day. And they put me in a hallway up on the second floor of this old wooden staircase. You had to go upstairs. And so the first thing I had to do was type an envelope to the Bologna Center. And I had to ask how to spell Bologna. So Priscilla Mason told me, she said, and memorize that address because you're going to have to type it a lot. So I did. And then the year went on, and I finally was moved downstairs to an office with the secretary for Robert Hall, who was the first director of what do you call it, fundraising.
Development?
One person, development and alumni, and he was it. So his secretary, Martha Brown, and I shared an office. And then admissions, Aldi was admissions, and he was also going to start the career services office. So for, I believe, as long as Aldi was in that job, career offices was a little wooden box, and you'd open it up and flip through an alphabetical card list of places that might be worth calling to see if they had a job opening. And I would type all these cards and take them in and put them in this box. And that was the career services. And then admissions was registrar's office. I did all the sending out of the applications. As I recall, that first year I think we had about 1,400 applications, and the size of the student body was at that time less than 100. So it was a good ratio, I think, back then to what probably the ratio is. I bet it's not that much difference in the ratio of applicants to those admitted and to the student body. But anyway, I would type everything, the letters of acceptance. We had to, at that time, they had to list 4 letters of people they wanted to write letters of recommendation. I had to write letters to all these people. Would you please? And there wasn't any, you know, it was all original typing. Because there was no fax machine, there was a mimeograph machine with ink, this black ink that you poured down into this drum and you had to turn it like this. But there was no easy way to duplicate things. And the carbon paper, you know, that old black carbon paper with another sheet on, you know, for the second page, or the copy. So I sent out all the letters of asking for recommendations. When they would send it back, I wrote a letter thanking them for it. Got the files together of all the students who had applied, and Aldi and some faculty, I think Bill Johnstone and Bob Leisted, I believe, and one other one were the admissions committee, and they would decide, and then they would tell me, and then I would type the letters of admission for somebody to sign, Aldi, I guess. And then financial aid was awarded in the registrar's office, so I would keep all the files and records and statistics on that. And so this all went along for 2 years, I guess, in the old building. And then we moved to this building. And at that time, the registrar and admissions would separate, and Aldi would get a person for himself, and the registrar would get a person for herself. And in the meantime, the registrar who was here when I started was Elma Baker. She left after 1 year, I think in '62, and a woman by the name of Miriam DeGrazia became registrar. She was registrar then from 63 to 78, I think. And she retired, and I became registrar then.
Mm-hmm.
But, so I was given...
To 78,
78, I think.
Is when you actually started as a registrar.
I was assistant registrar.
Okay.
I was assistant registrar. Well, first I was just nothing, just helper, secretary, whatever.
Yeah.
No title. And then in 64 or 63, I guess, Dean Wilcox saw a letter I had written to a student about something, and I had just signed it Betty Beachaump, staff member or something. So he sent me a nice letter appointing me assistant registrar.
Nice.
So that, but anyway, that when we moved here to this building, I was given a choice of whether I wanted to go with admissions or with registrar, and I selected registrar.
Okay.
Don't know why, I just did. So anyway, then we were down in the wing, that wing of the second floor, and Aldi was up here in the corner where admissions still is. And gradually over the years, the financial aid split off and had its own office, and obviously career services did.
Turned into more than just a box.
Yeah, it sure did. So, but the reason it was all the registrar's office was because when they moved here from, see, SAIS split off from Tufts University in
Fletcher School.
At the Fletcher School. And brought Priscilla, she was one who came, and several others. And it was just a very small operation, so the registrar, I think it was Jane Holbrook was her name. I'm not sure if she came from Fletcher, but they were so small, they just did everything. So as a result, the registrar's office continued to do financial aid for years, and finally that was split off. But there were a lot of things that just stayed in that office because they had just always been there. And nobody could understand why. And I would always try to say, because that's the way it is. Just, that's always the way it has been. It was things like Veterans Affairs, Foreign Student Services was in there. Now that's got its own office, Foreign Student. Financial aid was in there. Veterans Affairs. The PhD program was administered in there. Eventually, the SAIS handbook, the red book, we did that in there. We did the SAIS catalog in there for years until that I think was the first thing that went into some other office. But as we got bigger, we just couldn't do it all. I mean, and we stayed 2 people in that office forever until I left. There were 2 people in that office.
Until 2005. Wow.
And there were 2 people when I came. Me and, well, 1 and a half. The registrar and me, half time for her and half time for Alden Chapin. So there never was much of a increase in staff, but we got it all done and enjoyed doing it. And so that's sort of the history of
that's great.
How I got started.
That's great. Those are great stories. And what about in your, I mean, this is sort of a broad question, and you can think of it in decades or however, but what are some of your more vivid memories of SAIS? Maybe you want to break that up by people you knew, or historical events, or when things were built, or whatever.
Well, obviously the move to this building was in 63. Shortly after that, I remember I was sitting in my office, down in the registrar's office, when John Kennedy was assassinated. I remember very well.
It's funny, that's a story that everybody always remembers exactly where they were.
Right.
You know? So you were in your office.
I was in my office. I was in my office when the Twin Towers were bombed and attacked in New York. I was still in my office. So from there, 63 to 2001, that I was still in the same office. But in between, of course, there were the March on Washington, the riots after Martin Luther King was assassinated, the Kent State thing, which touched off the riots here and everywhere else.
What year was that again, remind me?
That was in 70... Wait, it could have been 71, I think.
71?
Or 70, 71.
Mm-hmm.
Sometime around there. The riots after Martin Luther King was assassinated, the city was in quarantine,
Mm-hmm.
or what do you call it? You couldn't get out of your house. Not quarantine, but
Martial law?
well, or what do they call it when the kids can't go out after a certain hour at night? Whatever that word is.
Martial law, I think.
No.
No?
There's a word, but at any rate, I was trying to get home, and there were people running up the street with clothes and TVs that they had just snitched out of stores that were, everybody had left, and the windows were broken, and people were stealing right and left, and so that was, we were home a couple days
Mm-hmm.
before we could get out and come back to work. And then the Vietnam War was a lot of unrest then, and a lot of kids. Of course, the draft and the selective service system was in effect then, and we were in that office responsible for sending out those forms, getting people deferred.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember there was a fellow by the name of Fred Abramson who was the class of about 64, maybe 65. He came in my office and he was going to Vietnam. He waved goodbye. Nice, big, nice-looking guy. He was over there very shortly and was killed. I think that was the first one of our students who was killed in Vietnam. I don't recall anyone else who was. But Fred was very proud to be going off to his job. And then we had just loads of people who were deferred. And that was a big job, keeping those people, if they wanted to stay at school, we had to send all these forms and keep them up to date. And then once that was over, then of course we had the Watergate business. And people would spend their lunch hours and whenever else they could watching all that on TV. And excuse me.
No problem. No problem at all.
You can cut that part out.
No problem.
But let me think. Then, of course, Johnson was in power. A lot of the higher-ups in the administrations would come to SAIS, as they still do, to give talks. And I remember Dwight Eisenhower came. His brother, Milton, was president of Hopkins for a number of years. And he came here once to talk, and I have a picture of myself shaking his hand when he came in the door. I think that was my first
That's great.
dignitary that I had ever met, and then over the years there have just been dozens and dozens of others that, and of course we've had some dignitaries who've come out of SAIS.
Sure.
A fair number.
Yes.
Madeleine Albright, Tim Geithner, who's probably the hottest ticket right now that came out of SAIS. But a lot of others, their names will probably come to me. Is it John Hamray, Wolf Blitzer? You've probably heard other people say all these same names.
No, this is great coming from you.
And but I remember one of the faculty, Charles Burton Marshall. Everybody, his initials were Charles Burton Marshall, CBM. So the students, of course, nicknamed him ICBM for the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. And he was a great, big, portly fellow. And he came in my office one day, and Wolf Blitzer had just been admitted. And he said, "What kind of a name is Wolf Blitzer?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, so it turned out, I believe, that Wolf was admitted to the PhD program and was one of Professor Marshall's students. So anyway, I thought for some reason I've always remembered, what kind of a name is that? So
did you end up knowing him well, or?
Yeah, of course. I knew all the students back in the 60s and most of the 70s very well.
What was Wolf Blitzer like then?
He was just a student. That I always laugh and say that if a student's name doesn't raise a red flag, they were good students, because you always get a few that were either trouble or in trouble of some kind, and those you remember in another way. But Wolf was, I knew him as a student, and he was fine. He was just a good guy. And he went from here to work for the Jerusalem, one of the newspapers in Jerusalem. I remember him telling me that, because he was so busy doing that he couldn't finish his PhD program. But then we've had a lot of our alums have done so well in everything. And their names right now don't come to me, but they will when I get home, of course.
That's great. How about favorite professors? Do you remember any? Or did you ever take any classes at SAIS?
I never took any classes at SAIS. But probably the most memorable faculty member, because of what I'm going to tell you, for me was Paul Linebarger. He died in 1966, and his wife, Genevieve, taught here also. She taught language, Indonesian, and she and Paul would travel a lot over the world. He was, in addition to being a SAIS professor, he was a Army colonel in the Army Reserves, and he was an undercover CIA agent. So they traveled a lot, and when they would go places, they would have their home mail sent here. And he asked me at one point, this was back in the early 60s, if I would mind just soaring through it and send them the first class and just stick the rest in a box in their office. This was going to be when they were gone for 6 months one time. So I said, sure. So doing that over the years, I got to know both him and his wife. And shortly before he died, he called me and asked me if I would take care of Genevieve if he should die. So I said, well, sure. I was 26-something and young. And he died then in 1966. So I remembered his call, of course. And, well, the result was I was at loose ends myself. So I moved to their home, and I lived there with his wife, Genevieve, for 15 years until she died in 1981. So I have very good, vivid memories, not only of him, but of his wife, and some of the tales that I've heard over the years about him and another professor, Kaduri, who came about the same time Paul did. And Majid Kaduri was an Iraqi fellow, and he was very prima donna-ish, like they all are, or were back then, certainly. And Paul wasn't so much that way, but he was still, they were all prima donnas. I mean, they were elite faculty. So Genevieve loved to tell the story of the time that, let me see, how did that go? Paul, when the dean, I guess Wilcox, or Dean Thayer, I guess it was, Dean Thayer went somewhere at some point on a sabbatical, Paul was appointed acting dean. And Kaduri's wife was very upset about this. And she approached Genevieve Linebarger at a party one time, and she said, I don't understand why, she was Arabic too, so she spoke in this Middle East accent, didn't understand why Paul was made acting dean. We were here long before you and Paul got here. So Genevieve said, well, we were actually here before that, but we were on sabbatical when you all came. So that put Mrs. Kaduri in her place, and she had nothing then to say about that after that. But, so I remember Paul Linebarger, of course, Bert Marshall I've already mentioned, Majid Kaduri, Vernon McKay, was African Studies, John Dreyer, Latin American Studies. I'm trying to think of the old ones back in the early 60s. Bill Johnstone was Southeast Asian Studies. Bob Tucker and George Lishka, all characters in their own right. I mean, they were, you know, smart guys, and they knew it, and it was very interesting to see them interact with each other and to get to know them, because I got to know most of the faculty pretty well.
That's great.
And even in later years, you know, also. But, oh, I hope I haven't left anyone out. I'm sure I have. But so anyway, that's the
great.
faculty that I have
you
memories
remember.
of.
Great. And just kind of moving then into kind of today, you've now been away 5 years, is that right?
Yeah.
Wow, and I'm sure they miss you very much.
Well, they've survived, so I'm sure they're getting along fine.
Yeah, but what advice might you have for today's current students?
Same advice I would have for students even back in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
All the students who come here are pretty top-notch. And they may have gotten over their feeling of being at the top of the class when they got to college and find out so is everybody else, and they're not so outstanding as they thought. But the students who've come through SAIS have just been really, really at the top of their class for the most part in college. So when they get here, they, of course, meet people who are in the same boat. And I would say that they should, as they always have, form good friendships with the other students and make bonds and acquaintances and form these friendships that will last over the years.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think in past years, the students have maintained these friendships.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very important.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just all studying.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a very important part of it.
Good. That's great. Well, thank you so much. And I guess I'll just give you a minute to think about if there's anything more you'd like to add. But
I'm
really,
sure there is. I can,
yeah.
you know, I had in my office
Mm-hmm.
a little file called the crackpot file. And over the years it grew. I mean, it got really... And Fred Holborn was doing a history of SAIS. And he wanted to borrow it. And Fred's office was... He was a pack rat. And he had to be shoveled out several times while he was here because of fire hazard. Because it was, I mean, you wouldn't believe the stuff. Somehow that file got it. The student who was helping him with his history assured me at one point that he had it, but to my knowledge, it's never come back. And that had some of the best anecdotes and tales and letters and stories. Not only about the current, this was 70s, 80s, but back in the 60s and 50s, because at one point I went through all the files to clean them out, and then we put them on microfilm. And there were a lot of letters in there that I did not throw out because they didn't belong in the student's file, but they were just too precious or too funny or too sad or historical to throw out. So I just filed everything in this file. Why I called it the crackpot file, because so many times we would get letters of inquiry from people wanting to study, or letters from people thinking we were the medical school.
Right.
Wanted to tell us about some new discovery they had. But we got a couple of letters from people who were in prison. They would write, and they had their prison number on the outside of the envelope. But so I just saved all those letters, and they were a wonderful collection of stuff through the years.
Mm-hmm. That's really neat. That's great.
Excuse me.
No problem. So, really, that's all I had for you today. It's been, again, such a pleasure being able to speak with you and
Well, I've had fun.
run down memory lane. And
I'm sure I'll think of 10,000 things after we
that's
finish
great.
this.
But there's so much rich history in what you've provided in the last hour or so. So, thanks so much.
You're welcome. I don't feel like I'm giving you much of anything because there's so much. You guys say it's rich history.
Absolutely.
It really is.
And it's hard to encapsulate 44 years into 1 hour, but
yeah, it is. That's one reason I brought these.
yeah. But thank you so much for your
Oh,
time.
you're welcome.
We really appreciate it.
I was delighted.
And not just today, but in the time you've given SAIS. Thank you very much.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
You bet.